Dr. Pranav Prakash, Dr. Hina Khalid, for having me over for this session for the second time. Unfortunately, I couldn't be there for the first time due to some unforeseen circumstances, but I look forward to the next forthcoming session over the couple of hours. And I also hope to benefit from the feedback coming from all of you. Today's lecture will look into some aspects of Sufi interreligious interactions in the South Asian region. It will cover the over long temporal spread between the 13th and the 14th till the 16th to the 17th, looking to certain aspects of these interactions, finally concluding with a case study on early modern Bengal, where we look into interactions between Sufism and the Vaishnava and the yoga traditions. So I'll start with the presentation. From the early centuries of the second millennium, Sufism matured through the consolidation of a distinct spiritual tradition that saw communities being formed around individual Sufi masters. Not only did this add to the geographical and cultural breadth of the movement, it paved the way for the formation of spiritual orders or silsilas founded by a Sufi master who traced his spiritual lineage from the Prophet. In the following discussion, we explore how one such geographical and cultural world, stretching from the frontiers of Afghanistan to Burma, that is pre-modern South Asia, the region which constitutes modern-day Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. With the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate, charismatic Sufi sheikhs settled down in the freshly acquired territories of the new Sultanate. Over the centuries, these shrines of earliest sheikhs like Moinuddin Chishti and Bahauddin Zakaria from the Chishti and Surawardi orders in Ajmer and Multan developed into major shrine cults that continued to attract large number of pilgrims. As the political authority of the Delhi Sultanate spread from Delhi towards far-flung regions, so did the network of Sufi saints, particularly the Chishtis. Eventually, almost every important province of the Sultanate had a resident Sufi sheikh who traced his spiritual genealogy through the master who introduced the order in India. Although the Delhi Sultanate did well in securing the formal recognition from the Abbasid Caliph, for all practical purposes, the spiritual domain of the Sultanate came to be influenced by the presence of these Sufi sheikhs after Baghdad was destroyed by the Mongols. In course of time, while the political fortunes of the Sultanate got inextricably weaved with the spiritual careers of these saints, it becomes greatly rewarding to explore the many ways in which Sufis in South Asia adapted themselves and connected in unique ways to the resident society and culture who had little exposure to doctrinal Islam or Sufism in their everyday lives. From the early centuries of the Delhi Sultanate, beginning from the 13th, one finds references to Sufis interacting with Hindu yogis and siddhas or ascetics, together with the followers of the saint Gorakhnath called Nathpanthis, who were based out of the northwestern region of Peshawar. By virtue of the geographical location, Nathpanthis could conveniently access a wide region from Central and West Asia to India. Hence, their meditational practice of yoga from time to time came to be picked up within Sufi circles. Interestingly, this circulation of Nath yogic knowledge coincides with the earliest horizon for institutionalized Sufi activities in North India. Important Malfuzat texts from the 14th century, like the Fawaidul Fuad and Khairul Majlis, record such interactions with Chishtis. Nath yogis were seen as primary transmitters of tantric yogic knowledge and practice into Sufi khankas. Identified in Sufi literature as practitioners of bodily and meditational rituals, these ascetics had complex relation with Sufi saints who were keen learners of corporeal practices of breath control, habs-e-dam, regulating breath, pas-anfas, meditational postures or asanas, intense ascetic prayer practices that led to experiences of semi-consciousness and ecstasy like samadhi, etc. Such adaptations to suit the Sufi goal recognize the value of these practices while making them acceptable to their disciples and the larger Muslim orthodoxy. But practices of encounter through competitive spirituality and miracles on many occasions turned Sufi-yogi relations competitive and hostile, even though their spiritual proximity was widely acknowledged. So that Nath yogis came to be addressed as Pir, a Persian term for the Sufi saint. Nonetheless, both groups had certain spiritual interests in common, which included, I quote, psychophysical techniques of meditation, unquote. A key marker in this history of continuous interaction between Sufis and Hindu Nathpanthis is the circulation of a Sanskrit manual of Hatha Yoga, detailing yogic practices titled the Amrita Kunda, or the Pool of Nectar, within Sufi circles. Such was the popularity of this treatise that it was translated into Persian and Arabic, the probable earliest one by a certain Ruknuddin Samarkandi in the early 13th century, who was the chief Qazi of Lucknow. The Chishti Sabri master, Sheikh Abdul Quddus Gangohi, from the 16th century, taught yogic practices to his disciples and incorporated relevant ideas from the Amrita Kunda into his work, the Rushdnama. During his exile in Gujarat, the Shattari saint Sheikh Muhammad Ghaus, again the 16th century, undertook a Persian recension of the work titled the Baharul Hayat, or Ocean of Life. Sharing of esoteric spiritual knowledge through the exercise of textual translation indicate a strong mutual respect which Sufis and yogis had for each other, refined through spiritual and esoteric practices. Yogis and Hindu ascetics were welcomed in the Khanqa and Jamaat Khana of Sufi saints, particularly the Chishtis, who benefited from such company. According to tradition, Muinuddin Chishti, on the advice of a certain yogin, introduced the audition of music in his public interactions. His successor, Kutubuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki, would visit the Hauz-e-Shamsi in Delhi for purificatory ablutions similar to a local yogin. Sheikh Fariduddin, the disciple of Kutubuddin, is famous in Chishti annals for his rigorous ascetic practices, many of which he borrowed from yogis like the inverted meditation that was adapted by Sufis as the inverted meditation of the Chilla-i-Makus. His spiritual successor, Sheikh Nizamuddin Auliya, was familiar as well as impressed with discourses offered by yogis at the Khanqa of Sheikh Farid. Embedding of yogic tantric texts like the Amrita Kunda within practices of classical Sufism clearly indicate an esoteric space where Indian Sufis were drawn deep into yogic practices, yet resisted a fusion by engaging with two independent spiritual traditions with conceptual parallels. The Deha Tattva of yogic tantrism with the classical Sufi idea of man as the embodiment of divine qualities and attributes. The Sufi practice of zikr, combining bodily postures with respiratory control, with asana, mudra, and pranaya. This could well be the historical context in which late 16th century texts like the Yoga Kalanda and later works emerged in Bengal, drawing generously from its tantric yogic traditions. Quite significantly, interactions between these wandering yogis and settled Sufis made two important knowledge systems, Islamic and Indic, speak to one another, thereby fine-tuning valuable techniques on how to control habits of sleep and hunger, undertake long spells of meditation and fasting under harsh conditions, and rise above limitations of space and time. The presence of Nathpanthi yogis and Hindu siddhas, who primarily came from the lower sections of the Indian society in Sufi khanqahs, enhanced the appeal and acceptability of Sufi saints across a wide cross-section of the society. Common masses who were welcomed in Sufi khanqahs could identify possible similarities in the lifestyle of Sufis and yogis, driven by poverty, social equality, and worldly renunciation. From the 15th century onwards, as the bhakti tradition began to re-engage with the long-forgotten philosophy of pantheism enshrined in the Upanishads, the movement interestingly coincided with the activities of Sufi saints too, who by then had marked their presence across the subcontinent. One of the ways in which bhakti teaching immediately connected to Sufism was in the concept of God and its relationship to the individual soul through emotions of love and longing. Bhakti saints argued on qualified non-dualism, where Brahma alone exists like Allah, but his existence is characterized and manifested in the material world through multiplicity and plurality, echoing with the Sufi master Ibn al-Arabi's pantheistic philosophy of Wahdatul Wujud, where all diversity is just an emanation of divine unity. Sufis, while preaching the idea of God in Islam as the supreme creator, eternal, formless, and beyond comprehension, freely tapped into Indic vocabularies of divinity like Gosai, Niranjan, Parameshwar, Omkar, Alak, Vidhata, etc., through their works of poetry. Similarly, Bhakti saints like Kabir from the 15th century and Nanak from the 16th century were deeply influenced by Sufi literature and vocabulary in Persian. Kabir's prolific use of Sufi terminologies, vocabulary, idioms, and metaphors in Arabic and Persian in his couplets indicate his familiarity and possibly some training in Sufism and its literature. Studying interactions between Bhakti and Sufi traditions in India has been a well-accepted approach to understand how practitioners of Islamic spirituality adapted with the society, culture, and everyday life around them. The results of such an interaction were seen by scholars as manifested through cultural developments, particularly in field of creative arts, spanning across literature, language, music, poetry, among else. At times, a familiarity of approach was emphasized upon, as in the case where scholars argued that the Indian tradition of Bhakti and Sufism at the foundational level upheld the concept of divine grace which could be accessed by the human devotee. But it is equally important not to fall into traps of hegemonic competitiveness between spiritual traditions along superior, inferior, or influencer-influenced binaries. One of the legacies of early colonial scholarship from the 19th century has been to portray Sufism and Bhakti in pre-modern India as the byproduct of one another, or an amalgamation of Christian and Vedantic traditions, which resulted in impure and debased spiritual practices. Rather than analyzing processes of assimilation and cultural adaptation, instead of diluting the spiritual core of Sufism, allowed it to be accepted into the lives and practices of diverse communities across South Asia. It is also interesting to note that Sufism in medieval South Asia engaged in deep philosophical and spiritual interaction with Saguna Bhakti cults as well, primarily the Vaishnava tradition, whose spiritual and devotional universe centered on the incarnation of Lord Vishnu, the cult of Krishna and his consort Radha. Vaishnava saints saw the love of Krishna Radha as the model and a metaphor for the relationship between the divine and the devotee. Such spiritual dialogue, by embracing Vaishnava Bhakti themes and tropes, was undertaken primarily by Sufis and scholars trained in the Chishti tradition, to the extent that dohas written in Hindi on the experience of love between Krishna and Radha came to be incorporated in Sama performance of Chishti Sufis, where the latter immerse themselves in spiritual surrender while listening to the poetry exemplifying Radha's love for Krishna. Public recitation of the Krishna tradition through devotional songs gained popularity from the 16th century by wandering singers, mendicants, ascetics, professional groups who performed in urban centers and rural fairs, not to mention Sufi saints. The central actors of this spiritual cultural interaction were not only Sufis, but importantly scholars trained in Islamic piety in Sufi khanqahs. They chose the life of a scholar over that of a practicing Sufi. In the second half of the 16th century, one such individual was Abdul Wahid Bilgrami, born into a reputable family of Sayyids and trained in Chishti Sufism. He wrote the Haqaiq-i-Hindi, or Indian Truths, in the form of a compilation of Hindu devotional songs to Lord Vishnu. In the ideas of Bilgrami, the names of Krishna and others are, I quote, a metaphor for the refuge of prophecy, that is, Prophet Muhammad, and sometimes they refer to him and other times to the truth of man, or the Hakikat-i-Insan, which is founded upon the essential oneness or the ahadiyat of God, unquote. Gopis stood for angels, while Braj and Gokul signified Sufi notions of the world, or the alam. Rivers of Ganga and Yamuna stood for the sea of Wahadat, or unity, and the ocean of Gnosis, or Marifat. Born and brought up in the multicultural North Indian society, Bilgrami was aware of the Krishna story and its meanings, and for the purpose of being used in Sufi musical concerts, Vaishnava hymns and motifs were detached from their quote-unquote original meanings and interpreted along quote-unquote Sufi meanings. Similarly, Malik Muhammad Jaisi's Kanhavat, or the story of Krishna, completed in the early 1540s, retells the Krishna story addressed to two audiences, the local masses who would listen to it in a rural communal space, for whom the storyline sticks to the Puranas, Mahabharata, and the Harivansa. The second set of audience are those trained in the Chishti tradition, for whom the episodes were reworked in order to foreground the allegory of love in the Sufi path through Krishna and Radha's relation and the impermanence of the material world and the human ego. Sufi institutions like the Khanka and the Langar are hinted at through through the use of terminology like the Dharmashala. Keeping in mind the duality of his audience, Jayasee interestingly portrays Krishna both as the incarnation or the avatara of Lord Vishnu, as well as the supreme God himself. In the classical Indic tradition of the Bhagavad Purana, Krishna is portrayed as the avatar. While for Sufis looking for familiar tropes that would fit well with their Islamic training, Krishna is the supreme God who manifests himself to be known and loved by his creatures, as he appears before Radha and the gopis first in disguise, only to emerge out of it. Sufi initiates are reminded that God manifests himself in various forms to his lovers and devotees. Krishna's assurance that, I quote, I am you and you are me, unquote, is a message all too familiar to Sufis from the Quran as they reach the highest stages of spiritual proximity with the divine. While Jayasee captured the world of Indian devotional traditions in regional vernacular, through the popular bhakti cult of Krishna and Radha, it laid the foundation of devotional love. Abdul Wahid Bilgrami engaged with the Vaishnava tradition of Krishna Bhakti and conceptualized it for Sufi thought and practice. The remaining part of the lecture then looks into the regional experience of Sufism in Bengal from the 16th century onwards, where it came to be influenced by two local esoteric traditions of spirituality, the Vaishnava Sahajiya and the Yogic Tantra. Historically, early 16th century also marked the rise of the Hussain Shahis, a new dynasty in the political horizon of Bengal, whose rule is popularly remembered as the golden era of pre-Mughal Bengal. The sultans of Bengal patronized the local population of Vaishnava-minded Bengalis and promoted indigenous literary and cultural practices, which manifested itself through local styles of mosque architecture, but most importantly in the vigorous support to Bengali language and literature. Maladhar Basu composed the Sri Krishna Vijaya between 1473 and 880 under Sultan Ruknuddin Barbak, and Jasuraj Khan wrote Krishna Mangala under Sultan Alauddin Hussain Shah. The former work centered in and around the Leelas or the acts of Krishna, the tradition of Krishna Prem Bhakti, devotion towards Krishna as the incarnation of Vishnu, as well as the embodiment of the emotion of love, human and divine, conceptualized as the beloved in Radha. The various interplays of emotional love through union and separation, or viraha, was seen as the natural or innate or the sahaj way of expressing devotion towards the divine. The yogic tantric tradition came to be practiced primarily by the followers of the Nath cult, who placed a strong emphasis on the human body as the site of spiritual power and its control as necessary to achieve spiritual prowess. These two currents became the primary influence among Bengali Muslim writers of Sufi literature from 1500, where the earliest influence came from the Nath yogic tradition, followed by texts oriented towards devotional Vaishnavism in the 17th century, which continues to outgrow Nath-oriented texts in the 18th century, so that by the 19th, finally, Nath imagery becomes rare. The Vaishnava emphasis on the emotion of love perhaps found a close parallel within the Sufi tradition, where the imagery of the woman lover could be traced back to one of the earliest Sufi women, of Rabia, the mystic from Basra. In Middle Bengali literature, the earliest exposition of Sufism and yoga in the style of a text on Islamic yoga is Yoga Kalanda, argued to be the foundational Sufi manual extant in oral form before it was written down in the 17th century by a certain Sayyid Murtaza, who lived in Murshidabad and was inspired by the Vaishnava tradition. Ahmed Sharif, however, does not ascribe any author to the Yoga Calendar and argues that all later Sufi texts followed this work in style and content. The work sticks to the foundational stages of Sufi spirituality, Sharia, Tariqa, Hakika, and Marifa, connected to the four corresponding stations or maqams: the Nasut or the realm of human essence, the Malakut or the angelic realm, the Jabarut or ruling power, and finally the Lahut or the world of divine essence and transcendence. In limiting the number of maqams to four, many assume a strong influence of Tantric Buddhism that may have resulted from Sufi Buddhist interactions, or the author of the text was aware of the meditational practices of Tantric Buddhism in Bengal, focused on the four chakras. The Nasut Maqam, guarded by angel Azrael with Muladhara chakra at the base of the spine. The Malakut Maqam, presided by angel Israfil with the Manipura chakra in the navel region. The Jabarut Maqam, presided by angel Mikhail with Agga chakra located in the head near the base of the palate. And finally, the Lahut Maqam with Anahata chakra located in the heart. That this branch of esoteric knowledge was widely transmitted in Sufi circles of Bengal is evident from similarly titled manuscripts from the 17th and the 18th century by Muslim scholars. Abdul Karim Sahitya Visharad located 300 manuscript copies of the Yoga Calendar in Chittagong. In these works, Sufi concepts are creatively mixed with yogic ideas and practices drawn from Tantra and Hatha Yoga, making it a deep-rooted eclectic tradition in the Bengali esoteric world. The emphasis of the text is on the performance of yogic psychophysiological exercises through the control of energy channels where vital energy circulates, and the nerve plexuses or chakras where cosmic energy rests in a latent state. Now coming to the work itself, Murtaza's work begins with the standard verses of praise to the Lord and the Prophet and his companions, the mercy of Allah, who is the creator of the 18,000 worlds or the alams. Thereafter, the author sets out to reveal the secrets of the four stations to the reader. The station of Nasut is described as the sacrum, a triangular bone lying at the junction where the spinal cord meets the pelvic bone. The angel Azrael stands guard there. This cavity is the place of fire which burns continuously here and is not extinguished. Sorry. The sun, carrying a highly symbolic meaning in the yoga tantric practice, is the source of the fire, is situated in the region of the Muladhara or the end of the spinal cord, the lowest plexus in the yogic tantric physiology between the anal orifice and the genital organs. It carries the form of a white lotus with four petals. The individual soul is its lord. In this station, the disciple should carry on the practice of zikr on the kalima with closed ears and eyes while continuing to contemplate on the master or the murshid to find the right way. The station of the Malakut is located in the lumbar region of the navel, where the vital wind blows at all times. And yogis identify it with the Manipura chakra, having a blue lotus with 10 petals. The place is presided by angel Israfil, and the gateway is through the nose. The disciple has to learn about the various types of vital air blowing in this part of the body, including the 40,000 breaths throughout the day. This air which blows is the only source of life, without which there is death. When meditating, the disciple places his chin on the throat and the right leg upon the left thigh and places his concentration, staring with both eyes at the tip of the nose. Only then the breath is controlled and confined within the body. An image of the soul or the Atma becomes visible. And one who can visualize this image at all times attains the ability to foretell events. The station of the Jabarut is located at the root of the palate in the region of the brain, where many things are located. This place is presided over by the angel Mikhail, and both the eyes are the doors to this maqam. This is identified with the Agga chakra and has a white lotus with 2 petals. In the region of the liver, wherein lies the solitary cavity, is an ever-flowing stream whose waters keep the body calm. In spite of trying to locate it with one's physical senses, this water is to be found only under the guidance of the master. Mystics call it the great lake of celestial nectar, or the Amrita Kunda, whose waters turn the drinker indestructible and immortal. The final station is that of the Lahut, which is the maqam situated in the heart in the human body under the guardianship of angel Gabriel or Jibrail. This station is also that of Mahmuda, wherein lies the throne of the Lord. While Mahmuda is a play on the name of Prophet Muhammad, the yoga calendar identifies the maqam of Lahut with the throne of the Lord, which is also the image of power and authority with a clear connection to the tantric notion of power or Shakti. Yogis popularly call it the Anahata Chakra, having a red lotus with 12 golden petals. The station of Lahut reveals to the seeker the nature of the Supreme Being. The yoga calendar associates each stages of the Sufi progress with a particular maqam or station in which in Sufism is paralleled by the latifas or subtle centers of illumination in the human body. That is gradual in its essence, depending on the stations achieved, and characterized by an unmistakable and irreplaceable spiritual experience during the practice of zikr. In the text, these Sufi maqams are synchronized perfectly with the chakras as immaterial subtle centers conceived to aid meditation without any objective physical presence in the human body. By connecting the chakras with Sufi maqams in a homological sense, the framework of Islamic yoga is clearly laid out towards understanding Sufi doctrine and practice in medieval Bengal. The impact of normative Sufi training is evident when we analyze the shifts in the above sequences of the tantric chakras. The latter originate from the base of the spinal column and culminate in the cranium in a vertical and hierarchical progression. In the yoga calendar, this vertical sequence is disrupted when the highest station of the Lahut is associated not with the Amrita Kunda in the head, but with the Anahata Chakra in the heart. In spite of being the source of the nectar of immortality, or Amrita, the seat of the soul, as well as the Sufi station, where one can achieve the vision of Nur Muhammad or the light of Muhammad. The Amrita Kunda is considered to be a lower biocosmological level than the station of the heart. This is where the Sufi emphasis on the heart as the seat of Allah is clearly evident. In the Sufi conceptualization, the spiritual heart is considered the locus of spiritual progress, achieving which the heart is turned into a mirror reflecting the divine. Early generations of Sufi saints like Hallaj and Al-Ghazali advocated the zikr of the heart or the silent zikr as far superior to the zikr of the tongue or vocal zikr as an exercise which polished the mirror of the heart. Here, the Sufi zikr formulas, the Islamic angels, and the idea of the Nur Muhammad largely replace yogic conceptions, tantric deities, and Sanskrit mantras, along with the emphasis on the knowledge and guidance of the master or the murshid. Yet, the Nathi yogic framework of the yoga calendar as a spiritual and meditational text is clearer in the section describing the stage of the hakikat, corresponding to the maqam of Jabrut, where the pool of nectar refers to the pond of semen containing the essence of the divine. Rather than its release by natural processes, the concern here is with the preservation and conservation of the semen by a reverse flow towards the root of the palate, where it remains locked, opening the road to yogic siddhi, supernatural powers, and eventually immortality. The final section takes to another text, which is in the form of a conversation. Sufi discourses presented in the form of conversations between the master and his disciples, with the aim to impart important lessons and respond to queries concerning spiritual training, has been a known practice since the pioneering effort of Delhi's poet laureate Amir Hassan Sisti to record the conversations of his master Sheikh Nizamuddin Aulia in the pages of the Fawaid-ul-Fuad in the early 14th century. In Bengali Sufi literature, Sheikh Chand's Hargauri Shambad, dated to early 18th century, follows a style generic in Tantric literature, where Shiva engages in a conversation with his consort Gauri to share the esoteric secrets of the Tantric and Yoga tradition. This work represents a strong tradition of continuous adaptation of yogic Tantric motifs by writers of the Bengali Sufi tradition. Such ideas were primarily drawn via the Nath tradition, emphasizing on yogic psychophysiological exercises, rather than the Vaishnava Shaujiya emphasis on sexual symbols and techniques followed by Tantra practitioners. That medieval Bengali Muslim writers on Sufism were not experimenting with local esoteric traditions, but had a diverse yet serious audience in mind, is made evident in a unique way. A parallel text of Hargauri Sambad, carrying the title of the Talibnama, was written for a Muslim audience, where the esoteric concepts of yogic contemplation underwent a translation process to be situated in a modified manner within an Islamic framework. In the latter, Shiva is replaced quite understandably by Sheikh Chand's own Peer Shahdaula, and the recipient of this knowledge is not Gauri, but the author himself. The author Sheikh Chand creates two narrative frameworks meant to appeal his readers from two communities who would associate themselves with the Hindu god Shiva and the Muslim Sufi saint Shahdaula as preservers of esoteric knowledge, and hence in a position to explain the intricacies of the same to their audience, Shiva's consort Gauri and Shahdaula's disciple Chand. By using two distinct sets of religious spiritual vocabulary, Chand does not attempt to mediate one cultural world to another audience. Rather, he builds up a narrative where the cultural worlds of Hinduism and Islam, primarily represented through Tantric and Sufi traditions, is shown in some kind of an equivalence rather than being imposed or pasted upon one another through processes of encounter between Sufism and local traditions. In the opening of the text, Chand describes the attributes of the formless creator before specifying the main gods from the Hindu pantheon, equating them with important angels, before offering respects to the rest of the 300 million Hindu gods and 300 million angels. The lesser gods and seers from the Hindu tradition are offered respects alongside the most important personalities in Islam, starting with the Prophet, his four companions who become the rightly guided caliphs, the daughter and grandsons of the Prophet. As holy places, Mecca and Medina are praised. The importance of being guided by the Guru or Peer is central to yoga and Sufism, here in the form of Shiva and Shahdaula, who guides the seeker towards the answers concerning life and death. The Peer is traced back to Nur Muhammad and through it to the Divine Lord. After the Peer, the focus of the seeker, as in the Talibnama, should be on the love and reverence for Allah and His Prophet, while holding strongly to one's faith. The importance of Sharia is emphasized together with its application through the observance of fasting, regular daily prayers, and if possible, a pilgrimage to Mecca. If such mandatory rituals are observed with a clean heart, the benefits of pilgrimage to Mecca can be obtained within the body, wherein lies the 18 cosmological spheres created by Allah. Regular observance of such practices is advised as effective in keeping the elements of the lower self or the nafs in order. Lust, anger, greed, attraction, jealousy, and arrogance, all indicating the Sufi conception of greater jihad. The conversation that takes place around the origins of creation and the universe is the longest section in both the Hargauri Samvad and the Talibnama. In the former, Gauri's curiosity on the secrets of creation is expressed through a number of questions to Shiva on the form of the Lord, the creation of the Lord, his color and essence, the formation of the three worlds, the heaven and earth, etc. The narrative in the Talibnama is longer and interspersed with Arabic terminologies and verses in greater detail. The description is close to Sambad And the poet, as a disciple, begins by asking his peer on the qualities of the Lord, his name, essence, form, along with the secrets of pleasing him. The description of this section on the creation ends with the peer narrating how the Lord, in his own image, converses with his creation, invoking a direct reference to the powerful imagery of the primordial covenant as described in the Quran, whereby all created souls are bound to their creator through the original emotion of love, which a Sufi seeker attempts to replicate in his material existence when striving for union with the divine. In Talibnama, the Lord, after creating creation from the Noor of Muhammad, asks the created souls who is their creator, to which all uniformly recognize Allah as breathing life into them and causing death in the world. Satisfied with this reply, the Lord directs all souls to take oath of discipleship from the light or the Noor by reciting the Kalima. In this description of the origin of creation, the tantric physiology of the human body as the microcosm of the whole universe is evident, confirming Sheikh Chand's familiarity with an inclination towards the Nath tradition, where different parts of the human body is imagined as a reflection of the image of God, as well as that of the universe. Clearly, it is not the passionate Sufi imagery of passionate love or ishq for the divine that helps in understanding Sufism in Bengal, but the dominant regional Nath cult influenced by yoga and tantric physiology, which served as a primary model for Sufi scholars in Bengal, while at the same time retaining extensive reference to Arabic phrases and Quranic metaphors for an evidently Muslim audience. However much in the dissemination of Sufi practices across Eastern and Western Bengal from the 16th century, an Islamized form of yoga was seen as integral to Sufi practice. There were challenges as far as Islamic orthodoxy was concerned. In order to address these embarrassments, where religious-minded scholars took strong offense to detailed descriptions of tantric sexual practices, Sufi authors went as far as to cite unconfirmed Islamic hadith traditions, which merited Islamic prophets with the pursuance of yoga as a means towards siddhi, thereby moving beyond extreme models of syncretism and or violent displacement. A complex and nuanced study of Sufi practices of interreligious interaction in medieval and early modern South Asia demonstrate a rather refined relationship where, in spite of real-time differences, forms of yogic meditational practices, Vaishnava Bhakti devotionalism, as well as esoteric tantric traditions, became integral components to Sufi religious sensibilities within a diverse and layered social environment. Finally, there are pertinent issues that have still remained unaddressed today in this lecture that reinforces South Asian Sufism's everyday appeal to a large cross-section of uninitiated masses. They are the greatest in numbers who are attached to charismatic Sufi masters and their spiritual grace in everyday lives, rather than being initiated through complex philosophical discourses. It is a form of interreligious interaction that unfolds irrespective of the living saint, through majestic Sufi shrines that are seen as the site of the saint's lasting barakah. Also, remembering Sufi concepts and teachings through the richness of vernacular literature, Punjabi kafis or Dakhani poetry, public recitation of Sufi romance folk narratives or prema akhyans, employing literary tropes of gender switching, where the saint is imagined in the bridal imagery of a woman suffering separation or viraha, yet desiring union with the divine beloved. And finally, the celebration of this very union through the commemoration of Urs attended by followers across religions. I'll stop here. Thank you.